Welcome to the fourth episode in this series where I'm going through my book, Divorce Your Remarriage. And in this particular episode, we're going to talk about the exception clause. Last time we talked about what Jesus taught in the Gospels in Matthew 5, Matthew 19, Mark 10, and Luke 16, but we skipped over the exception clause because it deserves its own episode. There's a lot of controversy over the exception clause, which I'll talk about in a moment. But first, I want to give you some quotes from some early church fathers. So first we have Clement of Alexandria. Alexandria is a city in Egypt. It was founded by, of course, Alexander the Great. It was like the cultural center of the Roman Empire during this period. They boasted a huge library. Now, a lot of those sources from that library were destroyed later on, unfortunately, but it was a great intellectual and cultural center of its time. And so here's Clement of Alexandria. He was like a professor. He was the teacher at the catechetical school. That's how you pronounce it. There in Alexandria early on. Actually, the school was founded by Mark, as in the person who wrote the Gospel of Mark. And this is, 200 AD. So it's not that far away from the time when Jesus taught. So here's what he said, quote, "Now that the scripture counsels marriage and allows no release from the union, is expressly contained in the law, quote, thou shalt not put away thy wife except for the cause of fornication, unquote, and it regards as fornication the marriage of those separated while the other is alive." So that's Clement of Alexandria, 200 AD, in his Stromata. Here's another person. Here's Irenaeus. This is around 180 AD. So again, early on. And he says, we're kind of like midway in a sentence here, but he says, "Our Lord compassionating that erring Samaritan woman who did not remain with one husband, but committed fornication by contracting many marriages." Then we have Tertullian. Now he's out in Carthage, so he's a little further out. This is around 212 AD, and my understanding is I think he was trained as a lawyer, so I think I would probably like Tertullian a lot. But anyway, here's what he said. He said, quote, "If we look deeply into his meanings and interpret them, second marriage will have to be termed no other than a species of fornication." So that was Tertullian. Now, here's what's interesting. These early church writers called remarriage fornication. And now, here's what's interesting. If you were to ask somebody, what does the Bible teach about remarriage? When it says that remarriage is a sin, when it's a sin to enter into, what is it? What's the word the scripture uses for it? We would say adultery. We wouldn't say the word fornication. I understand these are translations from old texts and they were using different languages and all that. I understand all that, but it's just interesting that they use the word fornication there because fornication is how you would translate the word porneia in the exception clause. So that's kind of interesting. But more to the point, if you want to get more specific here, Clement of Alexandria, he even says the exception clause is for fornication, which we all know because porneia is fornication. We'll talk more about that in a second. But then he defines fornication as a remarriage. He says it regards as fornication the marriage of those separated while the other is alive. So that's really interesting that he's defining the word fornication in the context of this passage of the exception clause as the marriage of those separated while the other is alive. So a remarriage. And now I want to hit you with Basil the Great, or maybe it's Basil the Great. I really don't know how to pronounce this guy's name. He's not around to tell me. But anyway, this is in the 370s. Okay, so he said this: "A woman who unwittingly marries a man abandoned by his wife for a time, and who has afterwards been left by him on account of his former wife's returning, has committed fornication, albeit unwittingly. She shall not, therefore, be denied marriage, though it were better that she remain single." So what this means is a man and a woman get married. Then the wife abandons him. Then he marries a second woman. She doesn't know he was married before. Then the first wife comes back. And he goes, "Oh, I'm going back to my first wife." And now the second wife, she's like, "Well, what happened? What do I do now? I was married and now he left me, but it was his legitimate wife. So am I just stuck because I got into a marriage that I didn't even know was an adulterous marriage? What does this second wife do?" She feels like she's like in an untenable situation. She's kind of been tricked into an untenable situation. What's the answer? And so Basil the Great, we'll call him Basil the Great for today. He says that she committed fornication, that her marriage was fornication, and that she will not be denied remarriage. So that's a very interesting. That's Canon 46 from Basil the Great. Okay. Um, so, why are these guys calling remarriage fornication? That's an interesting question. And then why does Basil permit the second wife to remarry? I mean, she was in a marriage. It was a government approved marriage. And of course, they were against remarriage. So why does he let her remarry? Why does he let her get into a second marriage? What is this exception he's making to the ordinary rule that when someone's married, they cannot go ahead and remarry? Why does he make that exception? So I think they interpreted porneia in the exception clause to refer to adulterous remarriages. So that's the premise here of this whole video, and the premise in my book, Divorce Your Remarriage. Okay. And now you may have never heard this interpretation of the exception clause before. If you've somebody who's studied this might be the first time you're approaching this because it's not like widely talked about as one of the interpretations of the exception clause. But let me tell you, and I'll prove it here in this video, it fits very, very well with the text, extremely well, actually much better than all the other theories that exist out there. So this is all based on my book, Divorce Your Remarriage, which you can get at Amazon.com. I'll have a link to it in the description below. The goal there is to help you learn, live, and where appropriate, lead in the area of divorce and remarriage. So go ahead and get that book and buy the book, read the book, email me your questions. My email is divorceyourremarriage@gmail.com. I'm the author, so I would be the guy to ask. And really, the questions that come up about divorce and remarriage in kind of the Christian circles, it's just an unavoidable question. If your friend comes and says, hey, why don't you come to my wedding, but she's marrying a divorced guy, you have to know how to answer that. Or if your pastor is going to officiate a remarriage, you have to know what's your position on that. So anyway, it's an unavoidable question that's going to come up because of the high divorce rate we have today. So we have to know what our answer is, and my book will help you understand that. Okay, so Matthew 5:32, Jesus is speaking on divorce and remarriage here. This is the Sermon on the Mount, and he says, but I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So that's the first time we see the exception clause. The idea here is a man divorces his wife, she's likely going to go remarry, and because she's likely going to go remarry as a result of his divorce, he is culpable for her adulterous remarriage. She's also guilty of adultery when she remarries, of course, and the man who marries her is obviously guilty of adultery. But the man who divorced her can't say, oh, not my problem. I just divorced her. I didn't force her to remarry. No. He is culpable for her adulterous remarriage. That's the point Jesus is making here in Matthew 5:32 in like that first moral formulation. And the second moral formulation just says, whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. It's just a blanket, truthful statement that actually has a lot of meaning that we'll get back to in a little while. Okay. Matthew 19:9, this is the second time where Jesus gives this moral formulation with the exception clause. And this is in the context of a dispute between Jesus and the Pharisees. As we covered in the last episode, the Pharisees come to Jesus in 19 verse 3, and they say, is it lawful to divorce for any cause? And Jesus says, no, look back at Genesis, look back at the Garden of Eden. The idea here was never for there to be divorce. And then they say, yeah, but Moses said this in Deuteronomy 24, to be able to divorce. There's a certificate and all this. How come we can't get divorced? And then Jesus says, well, Moses wrote that for your hardness of heart, but from the beginning it was not so. Going back to Genesis, saying Deuteronomy, the regulation, the civil law regulation in Deuteronomy is not where you get your moral teaching on divorce and remarriage. You get it back in Genesis. You're just looking at the wrong text here completely. You need to look back in Genesis, and then he gives this moral formulation. Let me read it to you. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery. So here in the two Matthew texts, we have these moral formulations about divorce and remarriage, and then after the remarriage, Jesus pronounces it's adultery. And so you might just think, well, all divorce and all remarriage would then be adultery. However, there's an exception clause. And so other people are wondering, okay, well, now my clean little neat theory that if you divorce and you remarry, it's always adultery, I don't know if I can hold to that now because I have this exception clause. I have to know what this exception clause means. What's the principle behind the exception clause? What's the rationale behind the exception clause? And really that rationale, the idea about the theory behind the exception clause becomes like the real center of the exception. So the exception clause says, except for sexual immorality, whatever that means, we'll talk about that in a second, but is, depending on what you think that means, that establishes a principle by which you might create other exceptions. And that's what people do if they misinterpret, in my opinion, they misinterpret the exception clause, and they derive a principle from that, and they expand the number of exceptions. So we'll talk about that here in a second. The idea here is there's a rule: don't divorce, don't remarry. That's the rule. If you remarry, it's adultery. That's the rule. And the question is there an exception? Some people will say the exception clause is just kind of mistranslated or misunderstood. So they'll say the exception clause is not an exception. I don't really agree with this, but here's what they say. They'll say, well, what Jesus was doing was he was setting aside the question of divorce and remarriage in the case where somebody cheated on their spouse. So you just don't know what to do. Is it okay to divorce or remarry from Matthew 5:32 or Matthew 19:9 in the case where there's adultery? So to find out what to do, you have to look at other passages that don't have the exception clause. And of course, since they don't have the exception clause, the answer is don't divorce and don't remarry. And this doesn't make a whole lot of sense, I have to tell you, because why would Jesus then set aside the question? There's no really rationale for Jesus to set aside the question, not like return back to it in a few seconds later. It doesn't make any sense. So I don't think that's what's being talked about here. I don't think it's a setting aside, and that's why this is kind of not a popular interpretation, but that's one way people try to read the exception clause. He's setting aside the question. Doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. Okay. Then some people will say, well, it's not an exception clause because how you should understand it is he means not even for sexual immorality. Now, the word sexual immorality, I should mention, is the word porneia. It refers to all kinds of illicit sexual conduct. And it's like the word fruit. People like to reference this. They'll say it's like the word fruit. It can mean all kinds of fruit, or it can mean a specific kind. And if it means a specific kind, that is generally indicated by the context. But here they're saying not even for porneia. That's how they interpret this. Well, that's nice, except the word even isn't in the text. Not for porneia. You can read that, read the text that way, but that just means except for porneia. So that means the rule doesn't apply when there's porneia. So that just doesn't really work because the word even just isn't in the Greek there. So that's why there's no translations that say that. And then there is another way people try to make the exception clause to not be an exception clause. They'll say it's not describing what is adultery. They will say it's describing when somebody becomes an adulterer. So this is you also have to be a lawyer to follow this logic here because it's a little convoluted. But what they'll say is when somebody cheats on somebody else, that's the moment at which they become an adulterer, not when they later on and go ahead and get remarried. So it's kind of a cute way to read it, except the problem is what Jesus says is that the remarriage commits adultery in Matthew 19:9, and that the man makes her commit adultery. So it's what the text is saying is not when somebody gets the label adulterer or adulteress. He is saying what conduct is adultery in this context with the remarriage, and the thing that is adultery is the remarriage. So that just doesn't work. It's just not what the text actually says. So these are three theories, are a little convoluted about ways to read the exception clause to not be an exception, and they fail, and that's why they're not really very widely received. So then the next question is, okay, so it's an exception clause. Okay, we got it. It's an exception clause, and it allows people to do something they ordinarily couldn't do. But what exactly is the thing that you can do that you couldn't do without the exception? And so some people will say, well, it allows divorce, but not remarriage. It allows divorce, but not remarriage. Matthew 19:9 has the exception clause, and Matthew 19:9 says that if you violate the rule, it's adultery. So the rule is divorce, remarriage, it's adultery. That's the general rule. Okay. And the adultery is the remarriage. Okay. So, and the way you know this is it's kind of obvious. Adultery requires sex, right? And so Jesus calls it adultery. Somebody is having sex with somebody. Okay. And divorce is not sex. So the rule is if you do A, B, and C, it's adultery. And here's an exception to that. So the exception is to make it so that it would not be adultery in that exceptional case. So it couldn't just be the divorce, it would have to be divorce and the remarriage. But people will say, all right, we hear what you're saying on that. But if you look at Matthew 5:32, divorce is adultery. Now let me explain why they say that. In Matthew 5:32, it says that if a man divorces his wife, except it be for fornication, that he makes her commit adultery. Now, all the man is guilty for making her commit adultery, but all he did was divorce. He didn't have sex with anybody else. All he did was divorce. That was the only conduct he did. So he divorced and he made her commit adultery. So people will say, well, he is guilty of adultery there. He's culpable for adultery there. So there's a way in which divorce by itself is adultery. So that's the kind of move they make based on Matthew 5:32. And so then they'll say, with the exception clause in Matthew 19:9, they'll say, well, the text is interestingly written and it's kind of difficult to understand, but that basically we think that the exception clause there allows divorce, but then not remarriage, because the adultery there it's speaking to relates to the adultery caused by the divorce, right? And if you start thinking about that, it doesn't seem to totally make sense. Like they have a little bit of a point, but it doesn't really fit really well. And so to really understand why it doesn't fit is because um, at best, divorce is adultery causatively, that it causes it. It makes somebody commit adultery. But with Matthew 19:9, it's not talking about making somebody commit adultery. The exception clause is there in a whole moral formulation where the conduct commits adultery. So makes someone commit adultery, Matthew 5:32, is very different than committing adultery. Making somebody else, causing somebody else to do something wrong is different than actually doing the wrong thing oneself. If the word adultery in Matthew 19:9 were to mean that divorce is adultery and remarriage is adultery, and the exception clause only applies to the divorce type of adultery but doesn't apply to the remarriage kind of adultery, if that were true, you have a problem. Because the word adultery has two different senses. And there's just no way, if you think about it, Jesus is speaking to a crowd and to Pharisees and to the disciples. And there's no way anybody would have been able to figure out this kind of convoluted moral mathematics that was allegedly at play here. Because they would have had to figure out, well, adultery, if it's divorce, is adultery kind of in a loose sense or in a causative sense? And adultery in a remarriage is a literal commission sense, not causative, but commission. And so Jesus is only applying the exception clause to the one kind of adultery, but not the other kind of adultery. And now, so that would be the whole theory. And so the word adultery would have to mean two different things at the same time, one kind of in a looser sense and one in a literal sense. And there's just no way you can read the passage and that any reasonable person hearing Jesus at the time would have concluded, oh, adultery has these two different senses, one for divorce and one for remarriage, and that the exception clause only applies to divorce and not the remarriage. So that's a very kind of complicated way of pointing out that this just doesn't work. The idea that the exception clause only applies to divorce and not to remarriage just doesn't work. And when you read the passage, it's just kind of plain reading. Here's a rule, here's an exception to the rule, and the rule prohibits the remarriage, and so the exception would permit the remarriage when it applies. So the person who I think best explained it, but better than what I'm doing now, was actually Wayne Grudem in one of his books. He addresses this, and he just really shuts the case on this. And I think that's right. I think the exception clause must permit divorce and remarriage when the conditions for the exception clause have been met. But so the real question comes down to, under what condition is the exception clause effective? To understand this question, first we have to go back and look at the text. So the text says, except it be for fornication. Now, look at that real carefully. Or except it be for porneia. Look at that very carefully. Does the text say in the exception clause who committed porneia? Does it say? It does not say. It obviously somebody had to commit porneia. It's intrinsic into the concept. It's an illicit sexual conduct. Someone's got to be doing something. So somebody did something. We don't know who from the exception clause. That's number one. We also don't know when from the exception clause, right? It doesn't say when they committed porneia. Was it before they got married or was it during the marriage? And we don't know exactly what kind of porneia actually occurred. So porneia, like I said before, is this, it means illicit sexual conduct of all kinds, heterosexual, homosexual, with an animal or whatever. So there's all kinds, right? And we don't know if this is referring to any and all kind of porneia, or if this is referring to like a specific kind of porneia, specific illicit sexual conduct. It just doesn't say. So we have to look at the different possibilities. There's three possibilities, actually. Okay, so it could be a man and a third party, a woman and a third party, or the husband and wife. Those are the three. Those are really the only three options. Okay, so the man and the third party. Let's look at that possibility. In the exception clauses, in those two passages, you'll notice the man is divorcing. The woman is not divorcing. The man is divorcing. Now, in Mark, Jesus talks about the woman divorcing there in Mark chapter 10, but there's no exception clause there. The exception clauses are only in the Matthean texts. So here's why basically nobody thinks it's the man and a third party. Here's why. That means Jesus is saying, by virtue of committing adultery, it gives somebody like the moral right to divorce and remarry. And that just doesn't make any kind of moral sense. So nobody thinks that's what Jesus means because it just doesn't make any sense. Okay. So then we have the second option, which is a woman and a third party. And this is the prevailing view in conservative evangelicalism. So the idea is that the woman cheated and it gives the man the permission to divorce. Now, the next step people will take is they say, well, it's not just that the woman cheated and it gives the man the ability to divorce. What's really being focused on here is that if there's an innocent party and a guilty party, the guilty party being the cheater and the innocent party being the person who did not cheat, then the innocent party is allowed to divorce and remarry. The guilty party would not then be allowed to remarry. So they take innocent and guilty in place of husband and wife, because they don't view it as being gendered. One view of this is that the porneia occurred before the marriage, not while they were married, but before they were married. Okay, so this is called the betrothal view. So the two are betrothed, and the idea is they had sex during the betrothal period. So people will bring up Mary and Joseph, and Joseph's concern that maybe Mary had sex with somebody else, and so he was going to put her away. And the betrothal language, it refers to the man as the husband and the woman as the wife, even though they're not like married. They're in like the betrothal stage. And they refer to a breaking of a betrothal as a divorce. So they said, that must be what this is. Well, here's the problem with the betrothal view. For Matthew 5:32 and Matthew 19:9 exception clause. Here's the problem with that. It's not in the context of Matthew 5. It's not in the context of Matthew 19. And I have read, I think, all of the early church writers on this, and nobody's talking about betrothal. So nobody thought about it in the early church. Now, it could be they all had it wrong. It's possible, not really likely, but it's possible. And it's possible that everybody just kind of knew this was about betrothal in Matthew 5 and Matthew 19. That's possible, but doesn't seem real likely to me. So I don't think that really works there. There's nothing really in the context also to limit it. So you could say that maybe it fits, possibly, technically, maybe it could fit, but there's nothing in the context to direct you to that conclusion. So that's not a real good way to interpret the scripture. You'd want something in the context to kind of point you in that direction. There's nothing in Matthew 5 or Matthew 19 to say that. So there's a second variation that people will point out, and that's the incest view. They'll say, well, the husband and wife who married, they must have been like brother or sister or something like that. And so it was incest. And so when it says except to be for fornication, what it means is except to be for incest. And people who promote this particular interpretation will point out other passages where porneia is used to mean incest. And again, the problem we have here is there's nothing in the context to say it's incest. And there is nothing in the early church that I've been able to find that anybody thought it was incest. So again, they could have all had it wrong in the early church. That's possible. It just seems unlikely, and there's nothing in the context to point that direction. So again, betrothal and incest views, I think, both fail for the same reason. Here's some problems with interpreting it as the innocent party to adultery view. So the innocent party to adultery view, this was the view that's been upheld by the Westminster Confession of Faith. This is actually, in some ways, the early church view, and let me explain what I mean by that. The early church said you could divorce if you're basically the innocent party to adultery, but you could not remarry. That's what the early church said. For the most part, I mean, you find that in a lot of different places in the early church. It's just all the scholars agree that was like the main view. And now we already talked about how there's no way the exception clause could only permit you to divorce and not allow you to remarry. So that's really kind of a problem. You have the early church versus like the text, and you have to go with the text. But now, where did they get this view from? Did they get it from the exception clause? I mean, they knew Greek, they were native speakers to it, a lot of these early church guys, and they knew the culture better. Maybe they just see something in the Greek that the rest of us don't see. This is an argument people use who want to kind of maintain and continue the early church view on this. And I don't actually think that really explains it very well, the Greek. I think what actually explains it better is a text from the time called The Shepherd of Hermas. And I won't go into all that and quote it for you, but The Shepherd of Hermas was a text from the early church period that had that was revered a lot by people in the early church, and it allowed divorce for adultery, but did not allow remarriage. And so it's possible that what the early church was doing is they were taking the Shepherd of Hermas and treating it as though it was basically a scripture, because we hadn't really formalized the canon of scripture yet, and they were looking at that and they said, oh, you can divorce for adultery, and they're trying to harmonize the Shepherd of Hermas with the exception clauses, trying to make it all mean the same thing, even though it doesn't really work exactly. And so that's how they ended up with this kind of view. But at the same time, we had, as I quoted earlier, Clement of Alexandria and Basil the Great and other people who seemed to say the exception clause was something else, that it was an adulterous remarriage, which we'll get into here in a second. Okay, but let's go back into this innocent party to adultery view, because maybe that's a correct view. And in fact, that was the view I had for 20 years. I thought that the exception clause permitted divorce and remarriage for the innocent party to adultery. And again, that's when one person cheats and the other one does not. So if neither one of them cheat, can't divorce, can't remarry. If both of them cheat, can't divorce, can't remarry. Only if one cheats and the other does not can somebody divorce and remarry. And the person who can divorce is the innocent party, not the guilty party. And the one who can remarry is the innocent party, not the guilty party. So it's only in that particular instance that's the innocent party to adultery view, enshrined in the Westminster Confession of Faith. Okay, as I began to research this more over the last year or so, I have these 21 books here behind me as part of all my research that I did, I began to find a bunch of problems with the innocent party to adultery view that had just never occurred to me. Nobody ever brought them up to me. I didn't know they were there, but they're definitely problems. And so here they are. One of them is what Origen said. Origen was somebody who was also in Alexandria, kind of during the time and after the time of Clement, and he said that this is kind of an irrational rule. Origen spoke his mind. We'll put it that way. He said this is kind of an irrational rule, and here's why. What is the underlying theory behind this? So a man and wife are married, the wife cheats, and so he can divorce and he can remarry, but he can't divorce her if, like, she tries to murder him. So suppose it was attempted murder. He can't divorce her and remarry for attempted murder. That seems kind of strange. Attempted murder would be, I don't know, at least on par, if not worse than being cheated on. Or suppose I don't know. Suppose she got pregnant. They had sex, the husband and wife. She got pregnant, and she didn't cheat on him. They're just very, very faithful. And then she secured an abortion, and he didn't want her to do that. And so he views it like she killed my baby. He can't divorce her for that. So he can divorce her if she cheats on him, but not if she kills his baby. That seems irrational, Origen said. But he said, yeah, it's irrational, but listen, this is the accepted view, so we're going to go with the accepted view. But he noted it's irrational, and it is kind of irrational, because what it sets up is a kind of a victim framework. It says you have a perpetrator and you have a victim. And if the perpetrator victimizes the victim enough to a certain level, wherever that level is, then the victim is given permission to divorce and remarry. And why? But so why would the victim line be just adultery, not other things? So some people will say, well, it's not really victimization exactly. It's just kind of the nature of adultery and how it just has a different nature to it. It's a different kind of sin that disrupts the marriage life. But if that's the case, then you would think adultery would allow both spouses to divorce and remarry, because what happened is, and it's an attack on the marriage itself. It's not about victim being given rights the perpetrator was not given. It's more about the problem that the marriage has kind of fallen apart, because adultery would have, under that theory, kind of destroyed the marriage. So, like Origen said, it is kind of irrational. It's really not easy to understand the theory behind the innocent party to adultery view. All right, and then we have another problem. This is the internal logic problem that I like to refer to as Schrodinger's marriage. Okay, so Schrodinger was a scientist who disputed this quantum theory physics idea, and he had something. He had a theoretical experiment that I don't think he actually did this. He didn't do it, but it was just to show how absurd the quantum theory is, and it's referred to as Schrodinger's cat. And Schrodinger's cat, the idea of quantum theory is that a particle can be in two different phases at the same time, which of course is like impossible, seemingly. And so he had this experiment where if it was in phase 1, his cat would live, and if it was in phase 2, his cat would die. And so then his cat is alive and dead at the same time because the quantum particle is in both phases at the same time. And this is supposed to disprove quantum theory, and it did not disprove quantum theory. It just kind of turned into a meme, and people said, "Oh, how deep is quantum theory?" Which is kind of funny. That wasn't his point. But anyway, we have a Schrodinger's marriage problem with this theory on the innocent party to adultery. And here's the Schrodinger's marriage problem. Suppose you have a husband and wife, and they get married. Okay. And the wife commits adultery. All right. And so the husband divorces her, and the husband remarries. Now, the husband is not committing adultery because he's no longer married to the first wife under this theory, because he falls under the exception. All right. So he's not married to the first wife. Therefore, his remarriage is legitimate. It's fine. It's not adultery. All right. But now the wife remarries. Right. Now, she's the guilty party. Now, her remarriage is adultery because she is the guilty party. But we have a problem here. Adultery against who? You would think it's adultery against her first husband, because that's what adultery is. You're married and then you're cheating on them. So you think it's adultery because it's her first husband. But if she's married to her first husband, how is that possible if he's not married to her? Because he's not married to her, right? We know that because he remarried and it was okay. But she remarried and it's adultery. So how does that work? How is she married to her first husband for her first husband isn't married to her? So hence we have Schrodinger's marriage. They're married and they're not married at the same time, which doesn't make any sense. So to get around this, people, and when I say people, I mean myself, because I did this also, they come up with a little theological duct tape, not in the scriptures, but they just kind of make it up. And the idea is they say, well, when you get married, you make vows before God. And so you're bound to your spouse. Husband and wife are bound to each other. But you're also bound to God with this vow that you made. And so when the innocent party to adultery gets a divorce, their obligation to their spouse and their obligation to God under that vow, both of those are gone now. And so now they're free to go remarry. And the guilty party, in this case the wife, while she's not married to her husband anymore because that obligation was dissolved, she's still obligated to God from her vow. And so it's adultery in the sense that it violates the vow before God. Okay, so that's a little weak, because that's not what adultery is. Adultery is not the violation of a vow, even if it's a marital vow before God. It's not the fact that somebody violated their vow to God. It's the fact that they cheated on their spouse. That's what adultery is. So that's a little loose. But people think, well, this is theological duct tape. It'll hold together. All right, but here's the problem you run into. Is Mark chapter 10, verse 11. It says that the remarriage is adultery, quote, against her. In other words, it's against the spouse to whom one was married. So that's what the adultery is. So that means you really do have a Schrodinger's marriage problem with the innocent party to adultery view, because it does envision the husband, the first husband, not being married to his first wife, but the first wife being married to her first husband. Hence you have Schrodinger's marriage. This is like a major internal logic problem with the innocent party to adultery view. Then we have another problem with the innocent party to adultery view, and that is, and I mentioned this in my last episode, Matthew chapter 19, verses 7 and 8. I argue that this passage rejects divorce for adultery. It rejects divorce specifically for adultery, and this was the fact, this is the insight that I gathered after doing all this research that made me abandon my view that the innocent party to adultery theory explains the exception clause. Okay, in verse 7, the Pharisee said, why did Moses command to give her a writing of divorcement? And they're referring back to Deuteronomy 24. And Deuteronomy 24:1, the writing of divorcement was for a matter of uncleanness. And a matter of uncleanness definitely includes adultery as a ground for divorce. It might include other things, but at least includes adultery. And so when Jesus then pushed back and he said, well, Moses wrote this for your hardness of heart, but from the beginning it was not so, he was saying that is not a justification as not a moral justification for divorce. So he rejects that. And this is also pretty easily seen when you look at the Talmud on this. These are Hillel Pharisees, and they're from the Hillel school, and he was a rabbi back in the day. And Hillel taught that Moses commanded divorce for adultery. So when they said in verse 7, why did Moses command to give her a writing of divorcement? They're talking about divorcing for adultery. And this is not just my view. This is also the view of David Instone Brewer. He's a scholar on the subject. He has a lot more permissive view than I have, but we agree on this particular fact that in verse 7, they were talking about divorce for adultery. Well, in verse 8, Jesus, again, he rejects that ground for divorce. So Jesus specifically, it cannot be that Jesus specifically rejects divorce for adultery in verse 8 and then specifically allows divorce for adultery in verse 9. That doesn't work. So that's another problem with the innocent party to adultery view that I think is just a very strong argument. This is the final challenge here to the innocent party to adultery view. The innocent party to adultery view imagines the wife cheating on the husband and then the husband remarrying in the text in Matthew 5:32 and Matthew 19:9. Now, take yourself back to roughly 30 AD in the land of Israel. Here's a big crowd. Here's the Pharisees. Here's the disciples. And they're having this whole conversation that we see in Matthew 19. Jesus says, he frames it as a man divorcing his wife for, let's say, innocent, for her cheating. Let's argue that let's stipulate that's what he's saying. Well, if that's true, the average person in the audience in 30 AD, now, not today, but in the 30 AD, would have only thought a man could divorce his wife for adultery. They would not have flipped around the genders. They would have not thought that a woman could divorce her husband for adultery. The innocent party to adultery view ignores gender. It just says, if your spouse cheats on you, you can divorce them and you can remarry. It doesn't care who cheated on who. That doesn't matter. It's just who's the victim, who's the perpetrator, and that's how the rule is built. The exception is built. But that's not what Jesus talks about. Jesus talks about a man divorcing his wife after she cheats on him. Back in 30 AD, they would have not flipped the genders. For example, we already know they all thought a man could divorce his wife, give her a certificate of divorce, but she couldn't give him a certificate of divorce. That wasn't permissible under Jewish law. So nobody thought the genders would be automatically flipped at that time. So if Jesus intended the genders to be flipped, he would have to specifically say that. But he did not specifically say that. So his audience would have been left with the view, oh, a man can divorce his wife for adultery, but not vice versa. Then we realize he cannot be talking about an innocent party to adultery viewpoint, because at most, he could only be saying that the man could divorce his wife if she cheated on him, but not vice versa. Now, this doesn't make any moral sense. And again, we already discounted the man in the third party. That doesn't make any moral sense. That would mean the adulterer gets moral permission to divorce and remarry because they committed adultery. That's a very strange right to give somebody because they committed adultery. So nobody thinks that makes any moral sense. So we already discounted one theory because it doesn't make any moral sense. But this doesn't make any moral sense either if you believe in the innocent party to adultery view, because you'd have to say it only allows the man to divorce the wife for adultery, but not vice versa. And the reason we know it doesn't make any moral sense, I mean, I think it's just kind of common sense that it doesn't make any sense. But also, if you're not sure about that, we've got 1 Corinthians chapter 7. In that chapter, which I'll talk about in a couple episodes from now, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul spends a lot of ink and a lot of time showing the rules are the same for men and women. If you look through that whole passage, it's just the rules are the same, one after the other after the other. He just repeats himself over and over and over again because he does not assume his audience is going to think the rules are the same for both. So because he can't assume that because of the culture at the time, he has to specifically say, no, these rules apply back and forth for both genders. The gender thing doesn't really matter. What matters is what occurred, and that gives the right to the other person to do this or that. Okay, so that's why it doesn't make any moral sense to be able to say that the man could divorce his wife for adultery, but the wife couldn't divorce her husband for adultery. And so that's the problem you have. So the innocent party to adultery view on its face must be wrong. There is a third possibility, and that is that the man and the wife who got married, that they're the ones who committed porneia. And that's my view, and let's explore how that's possible. So what about adulterous remarriages as that being the exception clause? Well, we do actually have it in the passage right there. It's talking about a remarriage being adultery. So the concept of illicit sexual conduct, of one particular kind of illicit sexual conduct, is very much in the passage because a remarriage is adultery. So I don't think we have that problem. I don't think we have the problem of the early church didn't say anything about this. As I quoted earlier, Clement of Alexandria specifically said that fornication was the idea of a remarriage. He says it right there in the Stromata around 200 AD. So we have that there. We have Basil the Great talking about a woman who was in an adulterous remarriage. Then her husband left her, and he said, well, she can go ahead and get married. And the idea was because her marriage was an invalid adulterous remarriage, so she can go ahead and get remarried. And so the idea there is that he seems to think that is an exception. And perhaps what he believed was that's what the exception clause means in Matthew 5:32 and Matthew 19:9, and that's my view. So I think we have a witness from the early church, and I think we have it in the context of the passage. So this is a view that we should take seriously. This is a real alternative view with regards to what the exception clause means. Okay, here's the other interesting thing about this. If you go back and you look at Matthew 5:32, and this is really interesting how easy it is to read this passage and just to miss this. Look at the second moral formulation there in Matthew 5:32. It says, a man who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. There's a number of different moral formulations that Jesus could use. And I have it outlined in my book. I have like all these different moral formulations he could have used as a second moral formulation, but this is the one he uses. And it's really interesting because it talks about the man marrying a divorced woman, not a woman marrying a divorced man, but a man marrying a divorced woman. And it talks about how that's adultery. And it talks about his guilt there. He doesn't talk about her guilt there in that second moral formulation. This makes a lot of sense if you take the second exception clause as the second moral formulation as Jesus explaining porneia in the exception clause. So the idea here is this. In Matthew 5:32, Jesus says, if a man divorces his wife, except it be for fornication, he makes her commit adultery. That's the moral formulation. And then he says, let me explain to you what I mean by this exception clause. What I mean by the exception clause is I'm talking about a man who marries a divorced woman. Now, there's a lot of stuff I said in there to preface the second moral formulation. Jesus doesn't preface the second moral formulation that way. But if you read the text that way, it makes a whole lot of sense that that's what Jesus is referring to by porneia. Now, here's something else that's kind of interesting. If you read the ESV, Matthew 19:9, the ESV translation, you'll see one moral formulation there, which says if a man divorces his wife, except it be for fornication, and marries another, he commits adultery. You'll see one moral formulation. But if you read the King James Version, you get two moral formulations. The second moral formulation is the same second moral formulation of Matthew 5:32. The second moral formulation says if a man marries a divorced woman, he commits adultery. So in the manuscripts that we do have that give us Matthew 19:9, second moral formulation, it's the same one that would make a lot of sense to explain the exception clause. And the other place we have this moral formulation is in Luke 16:18. We don't have a lot of context there, so we don't really know what was going on before and after. I think it's kind of a difficult passage to read in the context. We just have like, here are two moral formulations for your information there. We don't have a whole lot of context about that. Something else that's interesting about reading the exception clause this way is it doesn't have any of these internal logic problems. If you think through different scenarios, you don't run into any of these problems. There's no Schrodinger's marriage. There's no like one-sided, male female thing where it only gives rights to one side and not the other side. Because if it's an invalid marriage, it doesn't really matter who divorced who in that case, and then went ahead and remarried because the marriage wasn't valid to begin with. So that doesn't really matter. You don't run into the gender problem. It just all kind of seamlessly works together there. And then it makes a lot of sense with other passages. So like in Mark chapter 10, for example, there's no exception clause. And that's fine because Jesus there is referring to people who are invalid marriages. He's just not talking about the invalid marriages, which would be the adulterous remarriage that is in the exception clause. And then when Paul gives his general rule that husband and wives are bound to each other unless somebody dies, you see that in Romans 7 and 1 Corinthians 7, yeah, that totally makes sense, assuming they're in a valid marriage. Now, if they're in an invalid marriage, obviously we all know none of these rules apply if it's an invalid marriage. If it's an incestuous marriage, none of these rules apply because it's not a valid marriage to begin with. They should divorce it. Or if it's a marriage where one party didn't consent, it's not a real marriage anyway, so none of these rules apply. They should divorce that marriage. Or if it's a homosexual marriage, again, not a real marriage, they should divorce that marriage anyway. So people already know that these kind of different rules and moral laws don't apply to invalid marriages. So it makes sense you could have this exception clause or not have this exception clause, and you're still teaching the whole truth about valid marriages. Now, in addition to, we have the early church, we have the context there that allows us to consider porneia as being narrowed to adulterous remarriages. In addition to that, we have three 20th century translations. Now they use dynamic equivalent, and they translate the exception clause in a way that's very close to the view I just laid out. Now they're all Catholic translations, but the point is that these are serious scholars who understand the exception clause this way. So now my view is not Catholic. I don't think marriage is a sacrament. I don't think that there are higher and lesser marriages based on if they're believers or not believers. And I don't think that lesser marriages can be dissolved. I don't think there are lesser marriages. But the point is the scholarship, when interpreting and translating these particular verses, interpret the exception clause in a way consistent with the view I have. So I think there is some scholarship to kind of back up this concept. So here's how the New American Bible translate this verse. And if you're a conservative evangelical, you may have never heard this before. So hold on to your hat. Here it goes. I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, unless the marriage is unlawful, and marries another, commits adultery. So there it has the marriage being unlawful. So it doesn't say why it's unlawful, but it says it's unlawful. They're in the New American Bible, and that's, consistent with my view. I would just say it's more specifically, it's an adulterous remarriage. Okay, here's the New Jerusalem Bible. Now I say this to you, anyone who divorces his wife, I am not speaking of an illicit marriage, and marries another, is guilty of adultery. So again, illicit marriage is how it translates that Porneia view. Now, I don't really like this. I am not speaking of translation here specifically because people will say, well, they're saying it's not an exception because he's setting aside the question, as opposed to saying that there is an exception. And the exception is if your marriage is invalid. So I think that's kind of a imprecise translation, but the illicit marriage part is the relevant part for what we're talking about as far as the meaning of porneia here. All right, and then we have the New Catholic Bible. So it says, now I say to you, if a man divorces his wife for any reason, except if the marriage was unlawful, and marries another, he commits adultery. So now again, these are 20th century translations of the scripture, and it's in dynamic equivalence is the translation method they use. And I have to tell you, I'm not really a fan of dynamic equivalence or paraphrase or whatever. I like literal. Do it literal, and I'll do my own homework. Thank you very much. I don't need you to make a commentary and call it a translation. That's my take on that. But nevertheless, what it shows here is that these scholars think that unlawful or illicit is the proper translation. And of course, this also matches with what the Damascus document says. It's associated with the Essenes. And I covered that in the last episode. But let me just quote this portion to you again. It says, quote, shall be caught in fornication twice by taking a second wife while the first is alive. And then it talks about the principle of creation is male and female. In the ark, they went in 2 by 2, and a prince shall not multiply wives to himself, as kind of the rationale for saying a person will be caught in fornication twice by taking a second wife while the first is alive. Okay, so what's interesting about that here is it's fornication after taking a second wife while the first is alive, and the fornication there is between the man and his wife. Think about it. He marries a second woman, and then they say now that that's happened, he's caught in fornication twice. So that means one of those fornications is between the man and the wife, the second wife that he married. Now, some people will say the Damascus document is just opposition to polygamy. It's not opposition to divorce and remarriage because it doesn't specifically talk about divorce there. But that's not what it says exactly. What it says is while the first is alive. It doesn't say while they are not divorced. It says while the first is alive. So the idea is it doesn't matter if they're divorced or not. Here's what matters. She's alive and you took on a second wife. Boom, it's adultery. It's fornication is the word they use. Okay. And Jesus uses the same argument to argue against the divorce certificate giving moral permission to divorce. In Matthew 19, verses 3-6, we see Jesus going back to Genesis, and he says, go back and look at creation. He made a male and female, and then when people get married, there's 2 of them, husband and wife. So you have 2 in creation, 2 in procreation, and 2 in marriage, and you see that in the Damascus document, you've got 2 in creation, 2 in the ark, they talk about, and that the prince is not to multiply to himself wives. In other words, he's supposed to have just 1 wife, so there would just be 2. So this emphasis on 2 is important. It's supposed to be 2, not 1. 1 would be a divorce, right? And it's supposed to be 2, not 3 or more, which would be a remarriage. So the idea is that's why the emphasis is on the number 2 there. And they say that's just part of the creation. Now, as we mentioned before, the Damascus document was the Reformers and the Puritans did not have this document. So we don't know what they would have said if they had this extra biblical information. So when you read the Reformers and you read the Puritans, which I love to read them, you have to understand we have information they did not have. So the result is divorce and remarriage is adultery unless the marriage that is being divorced is invalid. That's the idea. And the invalidity is specified in the exception clause. It's a case where a man married a divorced woman, and that would work in reverse too if a woman married a divorced man. So such adulterous marriages, remarriages should be divorced. That's the only way to kind of end the ongoing adultery there. And then the man or woman who married the divorcee can remarry since they were never in a valid marriage. And I'll talk about that in the future when I get into different divorce and remarriage scenarios and who can do what after a divorce there. Subscribe, like, 5-star rate, comment, do all the things. Also, if you want to see evangelicalism become more biblical on the topic of divorce and remarriage, I have a Patreon account. You can donate, join the team, help get this message out to more people, more of our brothers and sisters, so they're aware of it, so they can consider it for their understanding of the scripture. It's patreon.com/divorce your remarriage. I'll have a link to it in the description below. And of course, buy the book, read the book, email me your questions, divorceyourremarriage@gmail.com. I have a link to that book in the description below. And I'll see you guys next time. We're going to cover next Romans chapter 7, where Paul tackles divorce and remarriage in the context of an analogy to the law. So that'll be really interesting. I'll see you next time.